pick up from work. And I'm very happy to host this lecture by Professor Newcomb. And we're just talking chatting, and it has took us 2 years, really, to bring him over. Because the idea first came 2 years ago, and said, gotta come, bring the Peabody gospel, right? And so very happy to have him here. And also want to thank the U.S. Consulate for facilitating the effort. So I'll just do a brief introduction and hand over to Horace. And Horace is the director of the Peabody Awards, and it's the award recognized outstanding achievement in electronic media, including radio, television, and cable. And it's one of the unusual awards because it's a very distinguished award in the United States, but it's one of the few that's open to international entries. And so Horace will explain more, I'm sure, in this talk. And Professor Newcomb is the Lambdin Kay Chair for the Peabodys in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia, the flagship school in the state of Georgia. And he's the author of, do I need this? He's the author of many books, including TV, The Most Popular Art, co-author of Producer's Medium, and editor of 6 editions of Television, The Critical Review. Actually, I have 2 editions. 7 now. Okay. I'm behind. Very hard to catch up. I do have 2 editions of the book. In 1973 and 74, while teaching full-time, he was also the daily television columnist for the Baltimore Morning Sun. From 1994 to 1996, he served as curator of the Museum of Broadcast Communications, with primary duties as editor of the Museum of Broadcast Communications Encyclopedia of Television, a 3-volume, 2,000-page reference work with more than 1,000 entries on major people, programs, and topics. And it is a definitive library reference work on the topic. And his research and teaching interests are very wide in media, society, and culture. He has lectured in Italy, Taiwan, Norway, Spain, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Korea, Switzerland, and China, and except Hong Kong until today. So we're really happy to have him here.
I'm very happy to be here, and I really thank Ying Chen for hosting this, and the consulate, as she said, for facilitating. We have tried to make this trip before, and this is the year that it worked. Ying is one of our board members for the Peabody Awards, and I'll have more to say about that later, but it's been a pleasure working with her, and it's a pleasure to be here to learn more about some of your programs. When we began to do this, Jim Laurie suggested that we have a topic, and we came up with something that sounds perhaps a bit more substantial than it should be, although I do want to touch on a number of major issues related to the development of television and what I see as the futures of television, and I use the plural purposely, and also to wind up by telling you a bit more about the Peabody Awards and the role that I think the awards play now and probably will continue to play in the history of broadcasting, because this was our 65th year. The Peabody Awards are the oldest award for electronic media in the world, and considered by many producers and practitioners in the media industries as the most prestigious. We think that that's the case, of course, and I think, give you a reason why that might be the case when I come to that. But what I'd like to do today with this rather large topic that was posted, which is also somewhat vague, which is the kind of topic I like, because if it's a general and somewhat vague topic, it gives me a great deal of latitude to talk about pretty much anything I want to. There we go. there's always a little technical moment that we appreciate here. And I'm going to begin my comments today with one of the most familiar distinctions that I think we all know of, and it's fundamental to the history of television. I think there is always some value in beginning with history as context, again, because there is some latitude with what we are concerned with, but also because I think that television is currently at a moment of perhaps its most profound change since the earliest days of the medium. Probably the most profound changes since the shift from radio to television. Certainly a set of changes that are more profound than the changes that came with color television, which for my generation was a massive moment in the history of the medium, and not only for viewers but also for the technologies and for the business of television. And the context that I want to start with today, and the comparison that's most familiar, is simply the distinction between public service broadcasting and commercial television, or commercial broadcasting for that matter. I think many of the issues that we face today are rooted in this distinction. I think that public service broadcasting is at a moment of even more profound change than commercial television in some ways, because there are all sorts of different perspectives that are emerging with each of those two categories. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of connections and connotations with the idea of this distinction. Public service broadcasting we associate with the BBC. We think of the BBC as a kind of prime mover in the history of television, and also as defining defining a set of characteristics which are quite different from commercial television, and in the eyes of many people, more important. And I think we probably we're somewhat mistaken in linking public service exclusively with the BBC for a couple of reasons. First of all, the BBC became a divided support system very early in its history, but also because, in my view and in my experience, almost the purest form of public service broadcasting is now found in the countries of the Nordic region in Northern Europe. I've spent a good bit of time working in Finland for the public broadcasting service there, and the differences that we find in public service broadcasting in Northern Europe and even in England and the UK, I think, are very strong. In part because it's linked to the cultural heritage of those countries in very, very powerful ways. And that's something that we can come back to later. We also know that public service broadcasting spread certainly to India and to other parts of Asia, and has been the major stalwart of broadcasting in those regions. Currently, I think one of the most interesting aspects of public service broadcasting is the attempt to develop broadcasting systems in the developing or emerging new nations that have broken away from the Soviet bloc that we see throughout Eastern and Central Europe. The attempt to define what broadcasting will be in those national contexts is a major question at this point. And it's a place where we see the distinctions between commercial and public service broadcasting being played out in very strong ways. The commercial broadcasting, as we know, is always identified with the United States. I do want to remind us all that there was a debate in the early years of broadcasting, certainly with radio in the United States, as to whether or not the system would become purely commercial, or whether or not there would be a way to make the U.S. broadcasting system find a mode of public support and public service. That debate was carried on rather intensely in the late 1920s, but by the end of that period, the shift had already been made, and public service was relegated to the side for many years. And as you may know, most of you probably know, the public television system in the United States is a very weak system compared to public service in most other countries. It's identified with the United States, but it's also heavily used in Latin America and certainly in some parts of Asia. So we have these two major support systems for broadcasting that have affected the history of television, the history of radio first and the history of television, which have moved us into the period that we now face. Now, the two models, and this is the point where I began to think more analytically about this, the two models have affected every aspect of television development. Every aspect of policy, certainly throughout the United States with the role of the FCC. Tomorrow I have a talk at the Foreign Correspondents Club, which everybody refers to as the FCC, and every time they do that I begin to think about the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, and I get a little confused before I remember that I'm going to be talking to what someone referred today to as a small gathering of retired British reporters. So we'll see if that's actually the case when we get there. But policy, of course, is a major issue that has been affected by the two systems that we're working with. We can refer to the multiple commissions that have been raised over the years in the UK to determine the future of public service broadcasting in the BBC. Certainly, technology has been affected by the difference between public service broadcasting and commercial broadcasting. How do we develop new technologies? How do we apply those technologies? Who is responsible for the development and application of new technologies, and so on. But perhaps the most significant distinction that's made between the two forms is in the area of content. Assumptions about the roles of audiences, and whether we refer to audiences or viewers or users of television, assumptions largely about the nature of society and culture and the way in which television and other broadcast media play a role at the center of society and culture. Recently, our FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, has been embroiled in debates over how far and in what way they can regulate content. By law, of course, the Federal Communications Commission is not supposed to deal with content. For the past several years, since the Janet Jackson event in the Super Bowl, Congress has been deciding or attempting to decide whether or not to change the rules regarding the regulation of content. Just in recent weeks, the fine that can be applied to television stations and television networks for broadcasting content that is defined as indecent has been raised from $32,500 per incident to $325,000 per incident. If this is applied to every station that broadcasts a moment that is defined as indecent, we'll see some major changes. There's already been what some broadcasters refer to as a chilling effect. That is, changes in content have been made to avoid definitions of indecency. It will be interesting to see whether or not this bill is passed, whether or not the President says he will sign this bill. It will be more interesting to see whether or not it's applied and how it's applied, whether the Commission will actually levy those fines on a regular basis. So, to return to the distinction then, public broadcasting services are considered, or public broadcasting systems are often decided as an ideal form of broadcasting. The purpose is to serve all audiences, no matter how small, to serve minority audiences and to serve specialty audiences, to serve children, to serve the disabled, to serve the elderly. This ideal, I think, is one that is made possible by broadcasting. When we think of the nation, the notion that the nation can be linked in this way and that all groups can be served, this is one of the major roles for our public service television. PBS can deal with controversial topics that some people would say commercial television often avoids. It can provide information for the populace of all sorts. It can provide education, and it can provide what was called in the Finnish system, for example, enlightenment. In the 1960s, when new broadcasting laws were created in Finland, entertainment was put at the bottom of the list, enlightenment was put at the top of the list, and Finnish broadcasting for at least 30 years followed that model. I can give you examples of why that model began to falter in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This can be summed up in many ways, but it is often summed up as public broadcasting systems relate to the audience, relate to the viewer as citizens. By contrast, commercial television, defined in the United States, is often cited as treating the audience solely as consumer. And the distinction between citizen viewer and consumer viewer, citizen audience and consumer audience, is one that drives much of the critique of commercial television. Commercial television, of course, is advertiser-driven and advertiser-supported. Entertainment is the predominant form of content, and entertainment is seen as, in the eyes of many critics and many viewers, as merely the hook for the commercial. Entertainment is the commercial for the commercial. Entertainment is that which draws mass audiences to the screen in order to have advertisers direct their messages to them. In a kind of generalized evaluation of this, then, we can say that in this view, public service broadcasting is noble, commercial broadcasting is corrupt, sleazy, inferior, and American. Those are the topics that are often put forward when we see this kind of critique applied. Both models, I think we have to begin to say, are grounded in the technology of television as it has existed until the past 2 decades, perhaps even the past decade and a half. And the issues and evaluations that I've described are linked to that technology, are linked to technological systems that have driven these kinds of distinctions and these kinds of critiques. Terrestrial broadcasting with a limited number of distribution channels is the defining characteristic of television until the mid-1980s. Now, I'm going to come back to that point later, but I think you can see where I might be headed if I focus on the technology as one of the driving factors that has led to the kind of distinction that we've made so far. But I want to back up now and treat some other implications of this history. The first of these is that U.S. television has been distributed throughout the world. It has been sold throughout the world. And the reasons for this are quite common and quite well known. U.S. television was cheap when compared to original production in most countries. After World War II, the United States, untouched by the major destruction that did affect most parts of the world, was simply the place where production could continue without any kind of development necessity. Most of the world had to rebuild broadcasting systems. Most of the world had to rebuild audiences and relate to television in a different way. Even with the BBC, as strong as it was, there was a period of faltering there, and a great deal of American television aired throughout the United Kingdom. But that material was not just cheap, it was also quite popular. American television did appeal to large audiences around the world. Now, we can talk about many reasons for that, and we can have a great discussion about whether or not this was simply pandering to taste, or whether it was demeaning taste, or whether or not there was something about American television that was actually quite powerful in drawing people to the audiences, whether they were adventure shows, mystery shows, comedies, which for the most part did not travel well internationally, but there was an appeal about American television that attracted audiences. The influences of these, now before I go into that, let me point out that this sale of American television throughout the world was crucial to the American economic system for television. The system was built on the sale of programming in aftermarkets, whether it was syndicated repeats and reruns throughout the United States, and the sale of those programs to independent television stations, or whether it was the sale of American television throughout the world. A program that would sell at one point for $5,000 in Germany would sell for $50 in Zimbabwe. For American television, it was all gravy. It was all profit over the top. Everything had been paid for at that point, and this fed the system enormously in terms of economic success. But it was more than just the programming that spread throughout the world from commercial television. It was the styles of programming, the formats of programming, the models of programming. The very fact of a regularized schedule was something that was not inherent in most public service broadcasting systems. When I began to consult for the Finnish Broadcasting Company in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the reason for that was that a third channel was going on the air at that time. Prior to that time, the Finnish system was a mixed system that was supported both by the state and by advertising income. Commercial broadcasters purchased time from the state, and a portion of what they made from their advertising went back to the state for the support of the system. The third channel was going up, and all of the commercial broadcasting content was going to move to that channel. This left about 1,000 hours of programming holes in the schedule. But that schedule had never been systematic. And so when people began to talk throughout Northern Europe particularly about the coming of commercial television, one of the factors that they objected to was a regularized schedule, which flew in the face of the idea of programming for minorities, programming for special audiences, programming for special projects at any time the producer and the system decided that it would be viable. Another factor, of course, was the coming of rating systems. The idea that you would have a regularized schedule which would facilitate ratings on the American model was a major point of contention when policy changes were considered. But the real issue, of course, I think in all of this is the complaint and the critique that embedded in these systems, embedded in this spread of commercial television, was not merely a format and not merely a style, but a set of ideologies, a set of concepts, a set of values that were objected to in many areas. Clearly, one of the strongest proponents of this view, Herbert Schiller, would argue that embedded in American television as it spread around the world was the ideology of American consumerism. That what was happening was the training of other nations, other cultures, other societies in a broad American way of life, which was built on consumerism, on advertising, and on consumption. And many people objected to this in countries throughout the world. Public service broadcasting was always seen as an alternative to this, even with its own flaws. And most proponents of public service broadcasting did admit to a great many flaws. The fact that it was in many systems a very elitist pattern of broadcasting, that in the UK, the Oxbridge crowd that ran BBC was simply imposing their own values on a broader populace. All of these issues were on the table. Everybody was aware of these. But public service broadcasting was seen as not merely an alternative, but an antidote to American commercial television. Now I'm going to back up again. And what I would like to do now is complicate this history a bit. I want to blur the distinction between public service broadcasting and commercial broadcasting. I would argue, and have argued in print on many occasions, that American commercial television does serve its public, that we find embedded in the most blatant entertainment programming the same kind of concern for issues and ideas, for concepts, and all sorts of various topics that we find in public service broadcasting. These are present in entertainment programs as varied as comedies, mysteries, medical programs. This is what I would refer to as, and have referred to quite frequently as, television as a cultural forum, a site where audiences are brought together around ideas and topics that are put forth in appealing and, in many cases, very lowbrow kinds of entertainment forms. My argument has always been that these are possible as sites for powerful engagement with ideas and issues. I base part of that on my own autobiographical experience. Growing up in the American Deep South in the 1940s and 50s, television was a way to see something other than what I saw around me. Television was a window that opened possibilities, particularly about issues related to race, that I saw nowhere else. Television was a radicalizing event in my own experience, which led me to all sorts of political activity and all sorts of arguments with people who were very close and people who did not appreciate what I was seeing in those television programs. Other people didn't see the same things. Other people were not thinking about it in the same way. My argument is simply that television makes possible this kind of engagement with crucial social and cultural issues. Now, if we go from there is it possible then to argue that the spread of American television creates something of a global cultural forum? That in addition to mere commercialism, American television has offered new ideas and new perspectives on the world at large. That in many cases, the coming of American television opened new possibilities for thinking about the world in different ways. Now, I don't intend to imply that this is a matter of accepting that material. The argument goes that people would consider American television, and in many cases might reject the values that were embedded there, might see their own cultural and social structures as much more powerful than what they're seeing in those entertainment programmings, whether they were read correctly, interpreted correctly, or misinterpreted. But that what happens with television in many cases is the creation of a cultural debate, a social argument about what is good for the populace, what is proper for the populace to consider. These are the kinds of things that are not often attached to discussions of television that rely solely on policy, economics, and technology. It's this cultural argument, I think, that has to be at the basis for what we think of as the role of television in a particular setting at any time. Now, the problem begins to be even more complicated. As more and more nations and regions reach a point of development where they are producing their own television, American television is relegated to minor places in the programming schedule. We still see a great deal of American television exported. It is a reduced amount compared to what it was many years ago, but it's still important for the American television system economically. But in many places, you'll find American television aired at 2 a.m., or you'll find it at odd places on small channels and so on. What we see is more and more local or regional or indigenous content of any sort alongside of American television, which makes the forum aspect even more rich, even more complicated, even more dense. And the new technologies that have emerged since the mid-1980s have complicated this for everyone, for public service broadcasters as well as for commercial broadcasters. Without falling into a kind of technological determinism, I think we can see the implications for what's happened. Multiple channels, a great many channels available for most viewers in any kind of developed situation. Increasing amounts of video on demand, where I can select what I want when I want it. The use of digital video recorders to multiply the options and to alter the schedule. The use of mobile devices. Maybe 5 years ago, as recently as 5 years ago, I said it'll never happen. People simply will not watch video content on cell phones. I've had to back away from that claim. I, however, refuse to do that. I did try to find a telephone without a camera in it. I ended up buying a new phone recently that does have a camera. But so far, I refuse to watch video on a cell phone or a handheld device of any sort. Interestingly, however, there are all sorts of other things that have developed that complicate television in the United States and around the world. The rise of the DVD as a market for television programming. I was astonished recently to read that Americans spent billions of dollars on DVDs of television programming, which had already been on the air, and that the most popular of these sales in the United States in 2004 was Friends. Now, I asked my students who can see Friends probably 3 or 4 times a day on any channel and see it every day of the week, why would anyone buy the complete box set of Friends on DVD? And the answer was quite logical. We can watch in a group at our own time, and we don't have the commercials there. So we can watch the entire history of Friends, the entire run of Friends in months. We sit together and we watch this. The second most purchased item was The Sopranos. The third was The Simpsons, which can be seen 5 or 6 times a day in the United States. But the whole question then is, with DVDs, with DVRs, with cell phones, with the multiple broadcasting systems, with the cable systems, with all that we have out here, how do we now define something like public service? What has happened to public service television around the world when we have the Discovery Channel doing nature films, when we have Animal Planet doing animal films, when we have health communication shown on health networks, when we have the Food Network? All of the things that we used to rely on on public service broadcasting to give us the minority viewing, and not in the sense of minority audiences, but the small amounts of material that we wanted to see about specialized topics, are now available across many, many channels of television. How do we define commercial television now, when it's doing the things that public service broadcasting previously did with a government mandate, and in many cases making money for it? The Discovery Channel begins as one channel and now is many channels, and we see this throughout the world. We see MTV adapting itself to cultures and societies throughout the world and having more than 100 channels around the world, plus its websites and all of the other ancillary materials. Is there a need, is there a role for public service broadcasting in such a situation? Is there a need for commercial television to say that it is still the same thing it used to be? Or we can ask this as a question: did commercial television win the battle between television, public service television and commercial television? Or we can ask it another way, and this is the way I've been thinking about it most recently. Is television dead? When I say that, I'm asking the question about a certain kind of television. What is the use of the term when we now have something that is much more akin to a library, much more akin to a bookstore, a music store, where we can get what we want, the content that we want? When I use the term television, most often in my mind it still refers to 3 broadcast channels in the United States. The 3 famous networks that I grew up with that changed my experience. Actually, in my early experience, I could only receive 2 of them in the town that I lived in. But from 1952, when I first had television in my home, through the 90s, I still think of television as network broadcasting. And now, when I think of television, I have to think of an entirely different configuration of technologies, of social structures, of cultural significance, because I think that television has become something else. And when I use television now, when I refer to the term, I put it in quotation marks, because I think that television, as we once knew it, is indeed gone, and television that we now refer to is a very different thing. And this is what I mean by the profound change that we're facing now. It's a change that affects the economics of the medium. It certainly affects the programming structures. It affects the ways in which audiences and users and viewers and consumers of television, and the term, I think, has to change now. It affects all of those things. It also suggests that we may no longer have a cultural forum of any sort. The interesting thing for me is, if I go back to that historical model, and I go backwards from television, and I think to the earliest forms of what I refer to as expressive culture, and after we move out of religion as expressive culture in the earliest days of human experience, and we go into drama, and we move out of drama and we go into literature, and in literature we go primarily to the great novels of the 18th and 19th century, and then we come into the late 19th and early 20th century and we have film. And the movies become that place where everybody goes to have that kind of experience, that shared experience of looking at something together and debating what it means and arguing over its significance. And then I go to radio, and for a brief period where that overlaps with the movies, and then I go to television and I see that. And in each instance, the central and centralizing cultural medium has been replaced by another central and centralizing cultural medium. And in the current situation, I see no center. I see no replacement medium that is taking the role of television, the movies, the novel, and great drama, to to bring social experience together. We are at a point of having multiple systems, a fragmented system, a very individualized system where we can get what we want, when we want it, in the medium that we want, and other people do not need to share this with us. It's a very interesting kind of situation because on the one hand, we have a great deal more content, we have a great deal more voices, a great many more voices are there, which we've always asked for. We've said with these centralized media, oh, that's the top-down version. That's them talking to us. When do we get our voice? Currently, we can have our voice. I have yet to read, I have yet to read a blog. I'm very wary of personal opinion. I've never appreciated personal opinion very much. I appreciate arguments. I want to have someone present evidence to me. It's not that I don't appreciate everybody's right to have an opinion. I think everybody should. I think everybody should write what they want to write about what they want to write about. I just don't want to see it. I'm just not interested in many people's opinions. I'm interested in moments when we can come together and debate and argue and really test our views, and I don't see that happening. I'm very old-fashioned about this, obviously, and I think that blogs probably are quite important, and they certainly are changing politics, and they're changing the face of the media, and I think that they give individuals great opportunities for creativity, but I am quite wary of their role. But I'm more wary of the situation in which we have a fragmented discourse, in which we have a fragmentation of the social structures of communication as we've known it. The term mass communication hardly applies at this point in our history. American Idol draws a mass audience. The Super Bowl, a mass audience. In some ways, disasters and tragic events such as 9/11 will draw a huge audience. But even at the moment of the World Trade Center attacks, I could turn to 20 or 30 different channels and get I would get many of the same photos, the same video, the same pictures, but I would get different perspectives, and I would hear different voices. And and in one way, that's a very rich experience. In another way, it leaves me wanting to know where the core is. What is the central idea? How can we deal with these issues? With American Idol, we deal with these issues by voting with our cell phones, and we surprise people by voting the favorite off the air, and we do that by hitting the repeat button on the phone over and over again. It's a very strange kind of election system. It's a very strange political moment when one person can simply continue to hit the recall button. Now, content producers are now entrepreneurs of all sorts. Individuals are. Libraries that various broadcasting systems hold in their archives are becoming very valuable because content is the issue at this point. How do we fill these channels? On the one hand, we have the individual kind of voices on the internet and the web and so on. But for the broadcasting channels, for all of the channels that we have that we call television, the issue is what do we put there? And how do we put on material that's expensive to produce, even though it may be less expensive in some cases because of new technologies of production. But how do we find the material to fill these hours? This is a major issue, and it will be in one way part of the salvation of public service broadcasting, because the PSBs do have major libraries of content produced over the years that will continue to be valuable, become more valuable actually. But when you see news reports of Mr. Murdoch or the heads of Viacom and so on buying new film libraries, it's because they need to control the content. They need to have that content to be available to use over and over again and to use in different ways. What's happening in the U.S., certainly with the major entrepreneurs, is simply a diffusion of funds. They're buying into systems that actually challenge their own supremacy because they don't know what's going to happen next. So Mr. Murdoch buys MySpace, which is a personalized internet web space that many of you may know about. Many of you may have places on MySpace. but to have that purchase for him means that he is now into a very different market with young people who are producing content and putting it on the web and so on. Now, let me talk for a moment about the Peabody Awards, because this is an issue that faces what we do quite regularly. The Peabody Awards, as I've said, are the most prestigious awards in broadcasting, certainly considered so by the American media systems. We are increasing the numbers of international entries. The Peabody has always been open for international entries. Obviously, in the early years, this relied mainly on entries from the BBC and from other English-speaking producing countries. But increasingly, we have entries from around the world, and we want to make that the case even more strongly, because we see, when we get those entries, we see outstanding programming coming from around the world. But we continue, the majority of our awards go to American materials. This year we received just over 1,000 entries. Our entries range usually from 1,000 to, I think the largest year was just over 1,200. There is an entry fee which prohibits some people from entering. On the other hand, most people can manage the $250 fee for entering a television program, or $150 for a radio program. And out of those materials, we select the very best that we think exemplifies excellence in broadcasting. That is our single criterion. I'm asked over and over again, how do you define excellence when you're looking at everything from major documentaries to small productions from local television stations? How do you define excellence when you're comparing a developing country with very small infrastructure in broadcasting to the United States and Great Britain with their highly developed systems? And our answer came from one of our British winners several years ago, when he said in his post-acceptance interview that the Peabody defines excellence on its own terms. That is, every entry sets up its own expectations. A small station that's struggling with a budget but does outstanding work in that context should receive a Peabody. Similarly, the major networks, which put their resources into play for major events and produce outstanding drama or do major documentaries, should be eligible and worthy of a Peabody. We give awards without categories. We do not give awards in specific categories, which means that in the final analysis, every entry out of that 1,000 is competing with every other entry. It means that entertainment is competing with education, that education is competing with documentary, that documentary is competing with science programs of an instructional nature, and so on. It makes the task of the Peabody Board very difficult and very exciting. We do our awards not by votes, not by checking off something in categories, but by a deliberative process that begins with our faculty and student committees at the University of Georgia screening 30 or 40 pieces of material and making recommendations to the board. The board meets at least 3 times each year. Parts of the board meet at least 3 times each year, and the entire board meets once a year. And we are not bound by those recommendations from the screening committees, because they see such a small portion of what we are actually considering in the final analysis. We often override their rejection of a piece of material, or we go back and find things that they approve and we say, no, this is not what we want to award for a Peabody this year. It's an exciting process, as Jean will attest. It is one that is not without some difficult moments. We think that we deliberate in a very civil fashion. There are moments of some tension in our discussions, but we sit around tables and we look at material and we listen to radio and we say, is this the best that we can find this year? Now, I don't think there's a single board member. There are 15 people besides myself. I have a vote as well. I don't think there's a single board member who would not say, if another 15 people were sitting here, there might be another 30 or 35 pieces that would be considered just as outstanding as the ones that we select. We don't claim to have picked all of the most outstanding material, but the things that we do pick, we say are in fact outstanding. Not only do we not give awards in categories, we have no set number. We gave 32 awards in the past year. We gave 34 the year before that. In 65 years of the Peabody Awards, there have never been more than 36 awards presented in a single year. The awards were begun in 1940. The first awards were given in 1941 for radio materials produced in the previous year. We always examined the previous calendar year for our awards. The first television awards were given in 1948. The first cable awards were given in the early 1970s, very early in the development of cable. We look for everything that we can find, and in the past few years, we have opened our admission to web-based work. Fortunately, from my point of view, we receive relatively few entries in this category, and we keep the categories for our own administrative purposes, divided by medium and by genre. We don't know what to do with web materials. Are we judging navigability? Are we judging content? Are we judging design? We give awards occasionally in broadcast television for the sheer beauty of the work. That stands as excellence in those cases. We see beautiful web pages. Are we supposed to do the same thing there? It's a very difficult question for us to face. Sometime in the next few years following my retirement, I hope that the board will find a way to deal with this issue. At the moment, I think we're still struggling. We don't receive very many. In the past 3 years, since we've begun to receive some web entries, we have given only one award for a freestanding website. We see a great many ancillary websites that are attached to television programs, and we always consider those, and in some cases it makes a difference. The only award we have given was to transom.org, which is a site which actually teaches people how to produce radio. It begins from the very basics of technology. It gives advice on what kind of equipment to buy. It gives advice on editing strategies. And the pieces that are produced for transom.org often wind up on public service radio, on National Public Radio in the United States. So we felt very confident about that award. Much of what we see is still too unsure of itself for us to be sure about it. The Peabody Awards, I think, are just without doubt the most outstanding award that can be given for electronic media because of that process, because we deliberate, because we debate, because we discuss every single thing that we do, and because every piece that receives a Peabody Award has been seen or heard all the way through by at least some members of the board and by screening committees as well, so that we consider the values of and the judgments of our colleagues. It's the only place that I've worked in an intense situation where people of very, very strong mind, very deep experience, will alter their point of view and change their mind because of their respect for their colleagues' perspective. To have someone say, you have persuaded me that this is one of the most outstanding works of the year, is a rare moment. I don't get it very often in academic discussions and debates. I do get it with the Peabody Board, and it's a rare privilege to be able to participate in that. What I would like to do now, before we have some discussion, is show you a piece that we produced this year that we call our Tribute to Winners. This is the short piece that we play at the beginning of the Peabody Awards ceremony in New York, which takes very brief clips from each piece, and we cut them together into a very nice production that is a tribute. At the awards ceremony, we also provide a longer clip for each person, each winner, which is followed by that person's acceptance speech. And these, in many cases, are among the most heartfelt and most reverent kinds of speeches that are given for our awards. We announce our awards immediately after the decision is made. So we announced our awards on April 4th this year. Our awards ceremony took place on June 5th. So everybody who is present at the Peabody Awards ceremony who is a participant is already a winner. We don't have the suspense of opening the envelope, but we do have people who are very pleased and honored to be there. Let me show you this piece, and then I'd be more than happy to have some discussion about my remarks today. Yesterday, a South African film, the first film to be transported internationally, it's exclusively in the Zulu language, was shown on HBO. Very powerful film about the impact of AIDS in rural South Africa. Highly personalized story, very different from some of the kinds of more policy-driven issues that we have. Olenka Frinkel's piece on fake drugs, which followed one of the crusaders in Nigeria, which reduced the amount of counterfeit drugs dramatically. There is an outstanding piece of work, and this was the third Peabody that she has received for her documentary exploratory work for the BBC. So all of these things come into play as part of the new role of television, I think, around the world, and gives you some idea of how we face the development of multiple systems, multiple voices, encouraging with an award to Radio Rookies in New York, which takes kids and really lets them tell very personal stories on radio, many of which wind up on NPR. The piece about the young man who was with his Army recruiter, the officer that you saw who was so outraged, came about because a high school student in Denver decided as part of a journalism project for his high school paper to see, given the decline in enlistments following the developments in Iraq, went to his Army recruiter and said, I'd like to join the Army. And he said, well, I've got this small problem. I'm a habitual marijuana user. And the recruitment officer said, that's okay. We've got something that we can give. We can tell you where to get a substance that you can be clean on the days that you have to do your physicals. He said, but I'm a high school dropout. He said, that's okay. Here's where you go on the web to find a fake diploma. And he paid $250, brought the fake diploma in, took it to the recruiter, and the guy was doing this. Then, of course, he went to a local television station and said, this is what's happening. They did the story, and they took these materials back to the recruiter, who at first denied any of this, and then was shown the tapes that they had collected, and then went to the supervising officer. All of this led to a one-day stand-down across the board, across the military, for New Orleans to do that, but they had taken lessons from previous hurricanes, moved their transmitter, had a plan devised to stay on the air, and did so. A lot of it was done over the web, a lot of it was done over radio. There weren't many people watching television in New Orleans those days, but they did provide information. Those kinds of things up against a great, very typical, we've seen them all before, the BBC's adaptation of Dickens' Bleak House, one of the most outstanding adaptations written by Andrew Davies, which is just a brilliant production, scheduled as Dickens would have done it in 30-minute segments and then rerun on the weekends. But this is the kind of thing that stands as excellence for us, and this is the kind of thing that continues to come out of the traditional broadcasting systems and increasingly from people around the world, and increasingly, I think, from new voices. So this is where we are at this point, and I hope we'll continue to give our award and we'll be able to deal with the new development. I'd be happy to discuss any of these items with you if you have any questions or observations.
Horace, I'm not sure that what I have is a question. Maybe it'll turn into a question by the time I finish. When I was growing up with television, no matter how fractured the market became, no matter how specialized, no matter how much it went after individual audiences, smaller and smaller niche markets, the news was always the place where people came together for the same content. It was the community moment. It was the shared experience. What dismays me now is that the news is a niche market. And, I mean, there's always been the equivalent of C-SPAN, which in the U.S. is the U.S. Congress going on and on and on and on. But now there's Fox News. And I don't want to single Fox out so much, but maybe I do. My brother goes to Iraq often. He's a civilian employee of the U.S. Army. And he told me something that really bugged me last time, that in all military installations in Iraq, in all circumstances, they only watch Fox News, and it's on 24 hours a day in every public area of every military installation in Iraq. Now, to me, news didn't used to be so instrumental. And I wondered...
Well, at least not overtly in consciousness, so.
Deliberately.
And I think that is one of your developments. I don't think it's at all surprising, but it does occur because of the niche nature of the markets now, and I think that in some ways it's surprising, and this I think is where the blogs do come into play. I mean, this is the expression of specific points of view is an increasing part of it, and we lose that sense that you spoke of, that collective sense. Now, the collective sense was in many ways a distortion already. And so the question is whether we're getting better news and more news by having different points of view. I think the success of Fox, the network and news in the U.S. speaks to the fact that there were massive numbers of people who felt that their perspectives were not being represented. And I think that,
to half those people.
yeah, and that's part of it. And we were talking yesterday, and Jim Laurie said, that the factor there is Roger Ailes, and I think that Roger Ailes is, in that regard, a genius in seeing what could be done by making the news more specifically into a niche that appeals to certain groups of people, large groups of people in this case. So, yeah. Jim?
Just have one question about the Peabody Awards. How would you compare the television Emmys to what you do?
The Emmys, I think, are largely a peer group award system. They are exclusively a peer group award system, but you get to vote for the Emmys if you're a member of the Academy. They're highly segmented in terms of categories. So you're comparing only apples with apples, and in certain cases, like documentary, you're really that one actually is more apples and oranges at times, but it is a small group of people who are doing each of these. It's done by a voting system. People don't discuss what they see. They sit at home. They used to sit in rooms. Now they mail out DVDs, and people can sit at home and vote on what they see. And then the nominees are done, and then another round of voting comes from that. There's an enormous amount of politics. There's an enormous amount of money spent in the Emmy campaigns and so on. Nobody spends more than $250 for us. Maybe we should start. Maybe we should open the door because we operate primarily on those entry fees. We don't have an endowment. We operate on the money that comes from that and from our awards ceremony and from some budget from the university. But the Emmys I see essentially as a kind of self-celebration. I refer to the Peabody Awards as a citizens award. It's a name I made up, but I think it's because we have people from various areas of experience who come together and talk about the media. Some of them, almost all of them have experience either working in the industries or working around the industries. We usually have at least 2 practicing television columnists on the board at any given time because they see much more than the rest of us do during the year. But we usually have a couple of academic representatives on the board. But most are not academics, and most are people who really care about the role of media in civic life more than in a professional sense.
The comedian Stephen Colbert from the Colbert Report often mockingly produced an award for the Peabody Award. Now, what is your view on these comedians who criticize the mainstream media, the major networks? What is your view on the role that they're playing?
I think what they're doing is very much in line with what I've been talking about the segmentation and fragmentation. I think that the late night comedians have always made fun of the mainstream media to some extent. Johnny Carson and people like that always did. It's more intense now with the mockery, with the parody. Colbert is a parody of Bill O'Reilly. I mean, he's playing a character, and I think that's a major distinction. And he stays in character all the time, which was not the best thing that he could do at the correspondence meeting when the president was present. Nobody enjoyed that performance very much, and I'm sure Mr. Colbert didn't enjoy the aftermath of it. But I think their mockery, or mockery may be too strong a term, their parody and their critique of mainstream media is, I think, part of a generalized sense of people wanting to talk back in a way. And Stephen Colbert, at some point, may in fact receive a real Peabody. We'll see. But in the meantime, he holds up his fake Peabodys because he's a fake news show. And The Daily Show, on the other hand, has twice received Peabodys. In 2000 and in 2004 for their election coverage, because the Indecision 2000 and Indecision 2004, which were the campaign-long, parodic, comic commentary on the presidential campaigns, were brilliant pieces of work and recognized right away by the Peabody Board as brilliant in that sense. And so when this year, as our host for the 65th Peabody Awards presentation, Jon Stewart was the master of ceremonies. He had some funny comments about the Peabody Awards. We take our knocks as well. He made the point that we're not broadcast. He said we're good, but we're not Latin Grammy good. I think that's an interesting role, because I think the critique of mainstream media is now generalized. That there are people who are expressing, some of it's political, some of it's stylistic, some of it is content driven, and so when the comedians tap into that, I think they find a ready audience. I think they find people who agree with them, and I think it's a very strong strategy for them to use. Other comments?
I'm really interested in the Anderson Cooper section on Katrina, because actually he was shouting to Congress,
That's
and
right.
it was pretty controversial in the U.S. when I was studying there. And I actually worked on a piece like criticizing him, because I thought that he was like an actor.
Many people agree with you.
So why did you guys pick that?
Well, this was a clip that we used, but this was not an award for Anderson Cooper. This was an award for CNN's coverage round the clock across the board. I hesitated in approving that clip, but we knew that they do have an outstanding team. There's Anderson Cooper, there's Gene Meserve, there are the people in the studio, and they all did some good work. I thought that his attacks were highly personalized and even mistaken. I mean, he says, "I'm seeing dead bodies in Mississippi, and they're showing New Orleans on the screen." So, I'm not sure how far I should go with my critique of Mr. Cooper. Let's put it that way. But I certainly agree.
Just following on from that point, do you think there's too much emphasis placed on individual journalists and news anchors nowadays? It seems to be, especially in the States, it's kind of cult of the...
Well, it's interesting. In one sense, we've got that with some places. Certainly, Fox, I think, trades on that to some extent. Some of the NBC, Chris Matthews type thing trades on that. I don't know that I would put them in the same category as I put other journalists. On the other side, one of the things that happens is that when Tom Brokaw retires and there's this sort of seamless transition to Brian Williams, is there a celebrity there at all? And the same thing happening now at ABC with Charlie Gibson coming on. I don't think of Gibson as a celebrity journalist in the way that some of the people on CNN are. So it's a very mixed situation with that. I think if a network can trade on it, they're going to do it. If they find the niche show that's going to work. One of the things that for me is disturbing as a viewer, not disturbing, but just annoying, is that when I watch CNN now, I can't find the news in the evening, particularly because they're doing 30-minute programs. They've got an entertainment show. They've got Nancy Grace doing something to do with legal matters. Mainly, it's screaming a lot, and so they're trying to find a way to program against other sorts of things. And their celebrity certainly pays off for them.
It astounds me. I remember Larry King, New Year's Eve, 1999 asking the Dalai Lama if Muslims celebrated Christmas.
Well,
She's been fired on the spot. I mean, do Americans watch because of Larry King?
Americans watch Larry King because of who he has on, and he doesn't. He makes a point of not preparing, and so that may account for that. He states that he doesn't prepare for the interviews. He gets a few questions from some staff, and then it's a conversation. And in a conversation like that, somebody will make an error like that, and people enjoy watching the conversation. But it's mainly for the guests more than anything else. One more question.
Does sports itself figure in the collective sense of people in Peabody? Given, for example, NBC's paying $1.5 billion for the 2008 Chinese Olympics, the Super Bowl. In fact, my friend and I last night had an experience when we went to a beer garden and saw the huge emotional outburst between the fans watching the Koreans play Togo. And does that figure in any way for Peabody's determination how television is affecting?
We certainly have given many awards for sporting events and reporting on sports because we see them as an important part of cultural life. The fact that NBC pays a lot of money would not figure into it. If they do an outstanding job, a different job of covering the Olympics, which given their last experience of covering the previous Olympics, I wouldn't hold out a great deal of hope unless they learned a lot of lessons there. But it certainly is the case that that people attend to sport and we attend to the programming that's submitted. We've seen some very good investigative journalism coming out of sports, for example, out of sports networks and other places. Some of them have made it all the way through to receive an award, and some have not. But it's a major part of cultural life around the world, as the Cup shows, and we attend to that.
Ying Chan has asked me to close things up, but she's had to run off.
Okay.
But I'd like to thank you, Horace, for
My pleasure.
being with us today, and thank you all for coming. We have something for you, and there's good news and there's good news.
Yeah.
This is a book from the University of Hong Kong, and the better news is we will ship it to you. You don't have to carry it in your suitcase.
I was just about to say thank you very much for another heavy book.
But thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.